Traditionally, we have two fundamental ways of thinking, sign thinking and subject-object thinking. They represent attitudes towards the world and forms of reason which enable us to master the world. They make the greatness of our civilization. Sounds good, huh? Unfortunately, these tools of power come at a high price. They separate us from the world and from ourselves. The sign splits the world up into the word, the signifier, and the actual thing, the signified. And there's no connection between the world and our access to the world, language. We, as the subject, deal with a world of objects outside of us, and which we can then analyze and use. Now let me illustrate this. Look at this powerful fortress. This is us. Out of fear from aggression and criticism, we build ourselves as fortresses. We want to be strong. We try to protect ourselves from the world. And finally, we want to dominate it, survey it. But we want to be in control, a solid rock in this hostile environment, the world. Of course, this sign and subject-object thinking does not always really work out. There are always various reasons why fortresses crumble down. But hey, that's life, you know. What makes the situation really bad is that we are constantly shut off the world behind those thick walls. Such a conception of life, establishing distance and opposition, isolates us and creates social, cultural, and racial prejudice. But every system of segregation also crumbles down one day. Now let's imagine an alternative vision of ourselves. Here we are integrated into the world. There's no real boundary between the multifarious elements. Everything is interconnected. There's humming in the air and fertile exchange of all sorts. All a bit less imposing than a towering fortress maybe, but it's definitely more pleasant. We all know that feeling, by the way, or so I hope. It is being in love, or when we are really moved by the art. In such a state, we feel connected with the world, and we are wide open, and that is a very fulfilling mode of being. Now, I like fortresses and ruins of fortresses, but for life, wouldn't you prefer to be a little bee flying around amongst the flowers and producing honey? Something has to change, and we have to think about life more in terms of the colorful meadow. That has come quite natural, doesn't it? After all, paradise as well is not depicted as a fortress. Now, how do we get there? We all want to live in the Garden of Eden, metaphorically speaking, but somehow feel constrained to build walls around us all the time. Life is tough. We want to feel safe and actually imprison us. I have two concepts to offer which serve as catalysts for different attitudes towards life. Thinking language and dialogical thinking. They are ways to overcome the alienation induced by sign thinking and subject-object thinking, and to be more in tune with life. Thinking language and dialogical thinking allow us to have a fuller vision of what it means to be human, and they allow us to think the arts and literature. Together they represent what I call poetic thinking. I define poetic thinking as a transforming power in the interaction between the forms of life and the forms of language. When we develop a better awareness of what language does, and we, within language, we transform the way we feel, think, understand. In short, the way the world appears. Poetic thinking, therefore, makes us live in a different world. I call it poetic because the Greek poiein actually means to make, to create. And I call it thinking because it still involves reason, albeit a wider notion of reason than the one our system of knowledge currently prizes. So what exactly is our first new concept, thinking language? Well, language is a key to meaning. You would think that our senses directly access the world. But actually, in order to make sense of our perceptions, of what we feel, see, hear, smell, we need language to translate these perceptions into our conscious mind. Our reality is consequently always determined by our relation to it. We create our worlds by dealing mentally with the diffuse perceptions in language. Language forms our perceptions in a way that they make sense to us, if we are lucky. A baby still has to learn this interpretation of perceptions. A baby does not always know whether to cry or to laugh. And we are still sometimes in the same situation when we are confronted with something that does not really fit into our already constructed framework of meaning. By thinking and talking differently about events, we are even constantly changing the past. Take, for instance, your relationship to a former lover. Seen from today, you might find it difficult sometimes to imagine how you felt about that person at the time. That means that we change the events, the meanings of the events in the past by talking differently about it, thus making them really into different events. Language is therefore not a product or a tool, it is a world-creating activity. A world-creating activity, poetic thinking, remember. Yeah? We actually change our world by using language. And life then is a constant interaction between the forms of life and the forms of language. Sign thinking cannot think this interaction. The sign communicates knowledge that is already existing knowledge. In this flawed conception, language serves only as a tool for things outside of language. Language, however, is a living continuum, a living process, always in you creating meaning that does not exist outside of this very process. A word on its own can mean many different things. It is only the actual moment of speech, with its situation and reference, sound and intonation, that grants the words their meaning. Consequently, we can say with the great thinker of language, Wilhelm von Humboldt, that it is not words that constitute speech, but on the contrary, words emerge out of speech. Words emerge out of speech. First speech, then the words. That seems counterintuitive to our analytically trained minds, doesn't it? But we can maybe imagine it in that way. We think of foreign languages that, first of all, when we don't speak it, seem like a continuous flow of sound. And only once we learn it, we start making out single words. Poems are another good example for the failure of the sign. We miss out on what actually creates meaning and makes life when cutting everything up into small units, which are, I admit, easier to handle and to grasp. But a poem is not a poem just because of the words it uses. It is poetic because of the way these words are articulated, because of the particular way they work together. So, in order to understand what happens in language, we have to look at this articulation, at this togetherness. Language only makes sense in its continuum. Thinking language as continuum allows to think the flow of life and ourselves as part of the meadow, in connection with others. This continuum is at the core of art and literature, and actually of human life altogether, of life. So the notion of rhythm, as developed by Henri Michonique, conceptualizes this continuum. Our general idea of rhythm is as a regular coming and going of the waves of the sea, is actually down to Plato. Before Plato, rhythm rather referred to the flow of a river, thereby designating a form in the process of moving. A non-fixed, ephemeral form in movement. A form in movement that is so difficult to conceptualize. But we all know that this is what life is actually all about. The uniqueness of the moment. As in the famous saying that you can only jump into, or you can never jump into the same river twice, right? So the same is true for language. You can never say the same thing twice. Conceiving of speech in these terms helps us to think life's uniqueness and to keep our mind open. You never know what's coming. It's a wonderful world indeed. So the way we talk about our relation to the world is quite revealing. We normally use metaphors involving our senses of vision and of touch. You can see that, no? We can easily grasp this idea, right? What we see and grasp is outside of us. On the contrary, if we shift away from the eye and the hand and towards the ear, our conception of the world changes. What we hear resonates within us. We merge with sound. In hearing, the world and I become one. Hence, the emotional power of music. Therefore, instead of to reason, we would be more in sync with the world by resonating. This is a wider form of reason in resonance with the world. And it incorporates this continuum of us with everything else. And that is poetic thinking. But I haven't told you yet about my second catalyst and concept of poetic thinking, dialogical thinking. Well, in fact, it has been with us all along, implicitly, since all the processes described so far are always dialogical. Indeed, in every language, the third person, he, she, it, stands for an object, something outside of us, whereas the you is always part of the sphere of the I. It doesn't represent anything. So we always talk to someone about something else. The you is always implied when we say I, and vice versa. A human being actually cannot even be conceived of outside of this unity with another human being. And dialogical thinking takes this into account. On the contrary, if we think of humans not as a you who is part of me, but we take them merely as interests or as factors of interest and calculation, then they are objects, not humans. Consequently, Martin Buber's dialogical principle distinguishes two modes of being, the I-it and the I-you. In an I-it relationship, the other is considered as an object. In the I-you relationship, however, both the I and the you emerge only out of this relationship. In this mode of being, which erupts only rarely, we do not see the other from the outside anymore, but together we form an all-embracing unity, the in-between. We all have experienced this moment when our defense comes down. Sometimes, in looking someone in the eye, I am drawn into a sphere of presence which I cannot control. Our fortress walls come tumbling down, and we are little bees in the meadow of life. Here we have the meadow, not the fortress. I am not a subject because I am in command of the world, but because I am realized in an I-you relationship. Being is always being with. Dialogical thinking is a way to overcome the subject-object divide. And everything becomes possible. We cannot master this I-you mode. It always emerges only for a moment of continuum, which establishes a new beginning and a new reality. Therefore, we can call it also the origin of life, again and again. And this brings us back to where we started, paradise. Well, maybe not quite paradise, and nothing is solved, but thinking language and dialogical thinking as catalysts for poetic thinking, understood as life in its living continuum, can change a lot of things, everything actually, because it represents a different approach to life. And finally, our life is our relation to it. Different ideas about language result in different ideas about our life, in a different life. Understanding the world as connected, and myself as being what I am, thanks to being in relation, enables us to feel an integral part of life. So no need for depression or feelings of disconnectedness anymore. But this goes beyond the personal level. For instance, poetic thinking affects our ways to translate or to teach, which are such fundamental ways of influencing our culture. And it also is immensely political, since a clear separation of social classes or cultures simply does not work in this new perspective. And how could you possibly make war when you do not consider the other party of conflict as a mass of objects? Well, we are far away again from our paradise, aren't we? But the biblical paradise would be kind of boring anyway, wouldn't it? We might not need a world of constant harmony where nothing really happens. What we can work towards, however, with the help of our two catalysts, thinking language and dialogical thinking, is a conception of world based on real interaction with the world. Then we do not need to block out the world from our fortress, but we can be part of the meadow of life. And that is poetic thinking. It thinks this continuum of life. For me, that is paradise enough, don't you think? Thank you very much.